In April of 2026, a single salmonella recall involving powdered milk from one California dairy processor spread into more than 40 different products sold at Walmart, Target, Costco, Kroger, and Publix simultaneously, without a single one of those chains actually running the dairy operation themselves. We bought fresh milk from 12 of the biggest grocery chains in America and checked what's actually behind the label at each one. Most of what we found isn't about any single bad carton. It's about how much of this entire industry runs through the exact same handful of processors, no matter which specific jug you grab off the shelf, and how little of that ever makes it onto the label itself. Why milk labels are more complicated than they look. Milk feels like the one product in the entire grocery store nobody thinks twice about. The one item everyone assumes is basically identical from carton to carton. It's white, it's cold, it's been in your fridge your whole life, and it's usually the reason you end up walking all the way to the back of the store, past every other aisle, because retailers know exactly how often people need to restock it. But the words on that carton, RBST-free, no antibiotics, hormone-free, organic, are governed by a patchwork of federal rules that don't always mean what a shopper standing at the dairy case would reasonably assume they mean. We pulled the actual labeling regulations, the ownership behind 12 major store brand milk programs, and the documented recall history tied to each one, and ranked them from most concerning to genuinely transparent. Every claim in this video comes from an actual FDA guideline, a company's own published sourcing statement, or a federal recall notice, not a guess and not an assumption. Grab whatever's currently in your own fridge before we start, because there's a real chance it shows up somewhere in the next 12 chains. Let's get into it. What RBST-free actually requires recombinant bovine somatotropin, a synthetic version of a growth hormone cows produce naturally, was approved for use in dairy cattle by the FDA in 1993 specifically to boost milk production. Since then, a specific tightly worded rule has governed how any brand can advertise the absence of it. A company can print RBST-free or hormone-free on a milk carton, but federal guidance requires the claim to sit right next to a second mandatory sentence in comparable size type, stating that the FDA has determined no significant difference has been shown between milk from treated and untreated cows. That disclaimer exists because of industry pushback in the 1990s when dairy processors that did use RBST argued a competing free-from label unfairly implied their own milk was somehow inferior or less safe. And it's the reason nearly every RBST-free carton in America carries that exact same disclaimer sentence somewhere on the label, worded almost identically from brand to brand, regardless of price point or company size. Some states went even further. Ohio, for a period, tried to ban the phrase RBST-free entirely, only for a federal appeals court to strike that ban down as a violation of the dairy industry's own free speech rights to make a truthful, non-deceptive claim about how the milk was actually produced. Here's what's actually changed since then, and it's worth knowing before we get into specific stores. RBST use in the American dairy industry has fallen dramatically over the past 2 decades, driven mostly by retailer demand rather than a change in the underlying science, to the point that going RBST-free has become close to the industry default rather than a genuine differentiator between competing brands. Almost every major store brand covered in this video, including the ones ranked lowest, already meets that specific bar, which means the label itself has quietly stopped doing the job it was originally designed to do, telling you something meaningfully different about the milk in your specific cart compared to the one sitting right next to it. Worth adding one more layer of nuance here before moving on. The American Cancer Society and major medical bodies have consistently found no established link between RBST use and human cancer risk, and the FDA's own approval decision rested specifically on the conclusion that the hormone doesn't meaningfully change the composition of the milk itself. The reasons shoppers still care about RBST-free labeling tend to be less about a specific proven health risk and more about animal welfare preferences, general comfort with fewer interventions in how food is produced, or simply momentum built up over 3 decades of marketing around the phrase. None of those reasons are unreasonable. They're just a different category of concern than the label's phrasing sometimes implies. What every carton already has to pass. Here's the second piece of context worth knowing before any of these stores get ranked. Under the federal Grade A pasteurized milk ordinance, every single tanker load of raw milk entering a processing plant in the United States, regardless of brand, price, or which specific store it ends up in, is legally required to be tested for antibiotic residue before it can be processed at all. A tanker that tests positive is rejected outright. The entire load is discarded, and it never enters the food supply under any label, store brand, or national name alike. That means the specific claim, antibiotic-free, when you see it printed on a milk carton, isn't describing something unique to that one brand sitting on that one shelf. It's describing a baseline every single gallon of milk sold legally in America already has to clear, whether the word appears on the label or not, whether it costs $2 or $8, and whether it's poured from a rectangular warehouse jug or a glass bottle with a farm's name etched into it. The actual meaningful differences between these 12 store brands live somewhere else entirely, mostly in how the cows were raised, how transparent the company is about that process, and how the milk has behaved when something further up the supply chain has gone wrong. That last point matters more than it might sound like at first. A carton passing the antibiotic test the day it left the farm says nothing about what happens to that same milk, or an ingredient derived from it like powdered milk 3 or 4 processing steps later at a facility the retailer itself may never actually set foot inside. That's exactly the gap that produced the recall this entire video opened with. And it's worth keeping in mind as a baseline fact underneath every single one of the next 12 store profiles. Costco Kirkland Signature Milk, both the conventional and USDA organic lines, is produced without RBST. And the organic version is also non-GMO verified, ultra-pasteurized for a longer shelf life, and in some regions available specifically as A2 milk, a variant containing only the A2 beta casein protein. Some people digest more easily. Costco's Kirkland Signature brand was named specifically in the April 2026 recall tied to California Dairy's powdered milk, pulled from warehouse shelves alongside similar private label products from several other major chains on this list. A reminder that even a retailer with as much direct supplier leverage as Costco still relies on a shared external dairy processing network rather than owning that part of the chain itself. The recurring joke among Costco shoppers is the actual jug design itself, a rectangular container built to stack efficiently on pallets rather than pour cleanly, a trade-off Costco's own CEO has publicly acknowledged at shareholder meetings after years of customer complaints about spills soaking the counter every single time the jug gets even close to empty. It's a minor complaint in the scheme of this video, genuinely not a health or sourcing issue, but it's a good reminder that a store's private label choices are frequently optimized for the warehouse's own logistics first and the customer's kitchen counter a distant second. Walmart Great Value Milk, Walmart's flagship dairy line, is RBST-free according to company representatives contacted directly by consumer researchers, matching the now standard practice across most large retailers covered in this comparison. Great Value was also swept into the April 2026 California Dairies recall, specifically for products containing the affected powdered milk ingredient rather than fresh fluid milk itself, a distinction worth understanding since powdered milk shows up as an ingredient in far more products across a given store than most shoppers realize, from baked goods to coffee creamers to protein shakes sitting nowhere near the actual dairy case. Walmart's sheer scale is the more relevant fact here than any single specific sourcing decision. As the largest grocery seller in the country by a wide margin, any ingredient-level recall touching Walmart's supply chain tends to cascade across more private label products and more individual stores than the exact same recall would at almost any other chain in this comparison, simply because of how much of the country's total dairy volume moves through Walmart's distribution network in a typical week. That scale cuts both ways. It gives Walmart genuine leverage to demand better sourcing terms from its suppliers, but it also means a single processor's mistake touches more households faster than it would almost anywhere else on this list. Kroger Simple Truth, Kroger's organic and natural-focused private label line, is explicitly marketed as RBST-free, and the company states the milk comes from cows raised without added hormones or unnecessary antibiotics, language that goes slightly further than the bare legal minimum most competitors settle for when describing their own dairy sourcing. Kroger's standard non-organic Kroger brand milk is also RBST-free according to company statements, meaning both tiers of Kroger's own dairy program clear that bar, not just the premium organic option sitting at a higher price point on the same shelf. Kroger's seafood sustainability reporting, covered in a previous investigation, tends to be some of the most detailed and specific in the entire grocery industry, publishing year-over-year percentages most competitors keep vague or don't publish at all. That same instinct toward publishing specifics rather than vague reassurance appears to carry over into how the company talks about its dairy sourcing as well, right down to the specific phrasing used to describe how its Simple Truth cows are actually raised. That consistency across completely different departments, seafood and dairy alike, is a reasonable signal that the transparency isn't limited to whichever category happens to be getting outside attention that particular year. A company that only publishes specifics when a journalist or a lawsuit forces the issue is a very different kind of company than one that's been doing it consistently for over a decade across multiple, largely unrelated product categories. Aldi Friendly Farms, Aldi's dairy private label, shows up consistently in independent dairy sourcing guides as one of the major organic milk brands worth knowing about, alongside names like Simple Truth and Kirkland Signature, all three of which are frequently processed through a relatively small number of shared organic dairy co-packers rather than owned outright by the retailers actually selling them. That's not a criticism specific to Aldi. It's simply how a large share of private label organic dairy actually gets produced across this entire industry, regardless of which name ends up printed on the carton. Aldi doesn't publish the same level of detailed branded sourcing information for its milk that Kroger does for Simple Truth, which makes some specific claims harder to independently verify beyond the base label itself. Given Aldi's well-documented history with seafood sustainability lawsuits covered in a previous investigation, two separate federal cases over the word sustainable that both survived motions to dismiss, a shopper who specifically cares about verifying sourcing claims rather than simply trusting the front of the carton has genuinely less to go on here than at a couple of other stops on this same list, a pattern that's now shown up consistently for this specific chain across two completely different grocery categories in this ongoing series. Target's Good and Gather and Market Pantry, private label lines, were both named in the April 2026 California Dairies recall, tied specifically to products manufactured using the affected powdered milk ingredient rather than the plain fresh gallons sitting in the dairy case. Target doesn't publish a dedicated standalone dairy sourcing policy the way some competitors do, and its milk program has moved through several private label rebrands over the past decade as the company gradually consolidated smaller, older store brands into the newer Good and Gather, name launched specifically to feel more premium and more intentional than what it replaced. That kind of rebranding churn isn't unique to Target, and it doesn't automatically mean anything is wrong with the milk itself sitting on the shelf right now. It does mean a shopper trying to trace a specific product's sourcing history back more than a couple of years runs into a genuinely moving target. No pun intended, since the label on the jug has changed names more recently and more often here than at several other chains in this exact comparison, making any single company statement harder to pin down over time. Sam's Club members Mark Milk, Sam's Club's private label line, follows the same broad GSSI-style sustainability framework the company applies across other grocery categories, and its dairy products are generally RBST-free, in line with standard industry practice at this point in the market. Sam's Club doesn't appear in the specific California dairies recall list circulating publicly as of this recording, though as a Walmart-owned subsidiary operating a largely separate supply chain for its own private label dairy, that's a distinction based on a different sourcing relationship rather than a fundamentally different underlying standard applied across the two companies. Sam's Club's bulk format, the entire reason most members shop there in the first place, does mean a single gallon purchase represents a bigger share of a household's total dairy spending than the same purchase at a standard grocery store down the street, which makes the specific sourcing behind that jug arguably worth a few extra seconds of label reading, given how much of it actually ends up in a typical member's cart over the course of a month. A 3-gallon jug sitting in the fridge for 2 weeks is a bigger bet on one specific supplier than a single half-gallon most shoppers replace every few days, which is a genuinely different risk calculation than most competing chains in this comparison are asking their customers to make without ever saying so directly. Publix's own private label milk was also named in the April 2026 California Dairies recall, tied to affected products containing the recalled powdered milk ingredient rather than the standard fresh gallons most Publix shoppers actually buy on a weekly basis. Beyond that shared incident, Publix doesn't publish the same level of detailed, quantified dairy sourcing information that a few other chains in this comparison do, which is a pattern that's shown up consistently across multiple categories in this ongoing series of investigations, not just dairy specifically, but seafood and other departments as well. In practice, that leaves Publix shoppers leaning more on the store's broad regional reputation for quality and customer service than on a specific independently checkable sourcing standard published anywhere a shopper could actually go read it. That isn't necessarily a red flag on its own. Plenty of well-regarded regional chains operate exactly this way without incident, but it is a real measurable gap compared to the handful of chains in this video that put actual numbers and actual written policies out every single year for anyone to go verify for themselves, rather than simply asking shoppers to trust decades of regional goodwill instead. Trader Joe's Trader. Joe's private label milk follows the chain's broader pattern of tightly controlled, relatively simple sourcing across its entire private label program, generally avoiding the kind of sprawling, frequently rotating supplier network that shows up at some larger, more geographically spread out chains on this list. Trader Joe's doesn't publish detailed, quantified dairy sourcing reports the way Kroger does for Simple Truth, which makes some specific claims harder to verify from the outside for a shopper who wants more than the label itself to go on. What Trader Joe's does have going for it here is the same thing that showed up in a previous seafood investigation covering this exact chain. No dairy-specific lawsuit, no dairy-specific recall showing up anywhere in the reporting behind this video, and a consistent reputation for simple, short ingredient lists across the entire store generally, even without the same level of published detail some larger competitors provide. That pattern, quiet rather than loudly transparent, but also quiet rather than repeatedly showing up in someone else's recall notice, is worth something, even if it isn't the same thing as a published sourcing report a shopper could actually sit down and read line by line. Whole Foods Market. Whole Foods requires its dairy suppliers to meet standards that go beyond the federal baseline, including specific requirements around pasture access for organic dairy cows that exceed the minimum grazing requirements set by the USDA's own organic dairy rules. A gap that's been the subject of broader industry criticism for years, since the federal minimum itself is considered by many outside researchers to be fairly easy to technically satisfy without much actual meaningful pasture time for the animals involved. Whole Foods' own house brand milk, sold under the store's 365 label, is RBST-free and sourced specifically from dairies the company screens against those tighter internal standards rather than the bare legal minimum alone, the same general pattern the company applies across its other private label grocery categories. Consistent with the pattern from a previous seafood investigation covering this same chain, Whole Foods tends to set the more rigorous standard among the 12 stores in this comparison, verified through the company's own supplier audits rather than relying solely on a single industry certification or a one-time inspection. It's also, true to form, generally the more expensive options sitting on the shelf, and that price gap remains the most straightforward explanation for why the underlying standards look the way they do, the same honest trade-off that shows up in nearly every category this ongoing series has covered so far: Safeway and Albertsons. Safeway, Vons, and the broader Albertsons family sell private label milk under the Lucerne brand, a name that's been part of the company's dairy portfolio for decades, long enough that plenty of longtime shoppers assume it's an independent farm brand rather than the store's own house label. Albertsons publishes less specific quantified sourcing detail about its dairy program than chains like Kroger, a pattern that showed up in a previous seafood investigation covering this same company and appears to hold true for dairy as well, right down to a similar general lack of year-over-year published percentages. That gap doesn't mean Lucerne milk fails any specific safety standard. Every gallon still has to clear the exact same federal antibiotic testing baseline as everything else covered in this video, no exceptions for any brand at any price point. It just means a shopper specifically trying to verify sourcing claims beyond the label itself has less published, independently checkable information to work with here than at several other stops on this list, which puts Lucerne in a similar position to a handful of other legacy store brands covered in this comparison, well-established, generally trusted, but thin on the specific published paperwork a more skeptical shopper might actually go looking for. Sprouts Farmers. Market Sprouts leans into its wellness-oriented identity with a dairy case that includes a notably wide selection of organic, grass-fed, and A2 milk options alongside its conventional private label line, considerably more variety than most competitors bother stocking in a single dairy case. The company's broader supplier documentation requirements, the same chain of custody standards covered in a previous investigation into its seafood sourcing, generally extend across its private label grocery categories rather than being limited to one specific department that happens to attract more outside scrutiny. That breadth of options is a genuine point in Sprouts' favor for shoppers specifically looking for a less conventional dairy choice than a standard gallon of whole milk, though it does mean the specific standard behind any individual carton varies more from product to product here than at a chain with one single uniform private label formula across its entire milk case. A shopper comparing two different Sprouts cartons side by side may genuinely be comparing two different underlying farms and two different standards, not just two different fat percentages, which puts a bit more responsibility on the individual shopper to actually read each specific carton rather than assume the whole store operates under one blanket policy. HEB, the Texas-based chain with an unusually devoted regional following that borders on genuine loyalty in a way few other grocery chains in this country ever managed to inspire sells its own private label milk sourced primarily from dairies within the state, a noticeably shorter supply chain than several national competitors on this list manage for their own private label dairy programs. HEB doesn't publish the same level of detailed nationally reported sourcing data that a chain the size of Kroger does, partly a function of operating a smaller, more regional footprint rather than a genuinely nationwide one spanning dozens of states. That regional focus cuts both ways. A shorter supply chain generally means fewer processing handoffs between farm and carton, fewer opportunities for something to go wrong along the way, which is a genuine practical advantage worth crediting. But it also means less of the kind of large-scale, independently published sustainability reporting that bigger, more geographically spread out chains tend to produce simply because they operate at a scale that attracts more outside scrutiny in the first place, from researchers, journalists, and advocacy groups alike, none of whom spend nearly as much time looking closely at a chain that only operates in one part of the country. Watch for this one at checkout. One more brand worth knowing, even though it isn't a store's own private label. Fairlife, the ultra-filtered, high-protein milk brand now fully owned by Coca-Cola, is sold at nearly every single store covered in this video, often sitting right next to each chain's own house brand in the exact same refrigerated dairy case in the same aisle at a noticeably higher price per gallon. In June of 2019, an animal welfare group released undercover video documenting severe abuse of cows and calves at Fair Oaks Farms, Fairlife's flagship supplier dairy in Indiana, footage that led to criminal charges against 3 farm employees and a wave of consumer fraud lawsuits accusing Fairlife of falsely marketing its milk as coming from humanely treated animals raised with what its own packaging called extraordinary care. Those lawsuits were resolved in 2022 through a $21 million settlement with Coca-Cola and its partners, alongside commitments to unannounced audits, camera surveillance, third-party advisory boards, and a publicly stated zero-tolerance policy for abuse going forward. In 2024, the same animal welfare organization released a follow-up investigation alleging similar mistreatment continuing at Fairlife-associated farms, despite those exact reforms supposedly already being in place and actively monitored. Fairlife has continued to grow rapidly regardless of any of this, and multiple major retailers that briefly pulled the product off shelves back in 2019 have long since brought it back, apparently with little lasting effect on sales. This isn't a store-specific failure the way some of the entries earlier in this video are, since no single chain in this comparison actually controls Fairlife's supply chain or its supplier relationships. But it is worth knowing that the premium, ethically marketed carton sitting right next to the plain, unglamorous store brand milk has a documented, repeated history worth being aware of before paying the markup specifically for that particular promise. The actual verdict. So here's where 12 store brands actually land side by side. Almost every single one of them, from Aldi's Friendly Farms up through Costco's Kirkland signature, already clears the RBST-free bar that used to be a genuine differentiator and has since become close to standard practice across the entire industry, which means that specific claim alone tells you almost nothing useful about which carton to actually pick. 5 of these chains, Walmart, Target, Costco, Kroger, and Publix, were all swept into the same April 2026 salmonella recall tied to one shared powdered milk supplier, a reminder that private label branding often disguises just how much of this entire industry runs through a small number of shared processors, no matter how different the packaging looks sitting on 2 different shelves. And a smaller handful, Kroger and Whole Foods especially, publish the kind of specific checkable sourcing detail that actually lets a shopper verify a claim instead of simply trusting whatever's printed on the front of the carton. None of this means any specific carton covered in this video is unsafe to pour into your coffee tonight. Every single one clears the same federal safety floor, regardless of price, branding, or how wholesome the packaging happens to look under fluorescent store lighting. It means the specific words on that carton, RBST-free, antibiotic-free, organic, natural, are only ever as meaningful as the actual baseline they're being measured against. And in milk specifically, that baseline turns out to be a lot higher and a lot more universal than most of these labels quietly want you to assume when you're the only one standing in the dairy aisle trying to decide which jug is actually worth the extra dollar. The FDA and USDA both maintain free, searchable recall databases for exactly this reason. And given how many of the 12 chains in this video already showed up in the exact same recall this year, checking them every few months is a habit worth building into your next grocery run, right alongside actually reading what's printed underneath the brand name.